March 3, 1943. Dawn, unfurling over Port Moresby, New Guinea. Major Edward Lana's hands remained calm on the control yoke of his B-25 Mitchell as he monitored his fuel indicators and listened to the steady roar of the twin radial engines. Through the scored plexiglass of his cockpit window, he could make out 11 more B-25s assembling astern, their propellers carving silver discs through the tropical morning. What the Japanese convoy steaming toward them in the Bismarck Sea did not realize was that within the next quarter hour, everything they assumed about naval combat would be upended by a bombing method so perilous, so unconventional that orthodox military judgment had deemed it almost suicidal. The arithmetic of destruction was about to be rewritten not in the familiar tongue of high-altitude precision strikes, but in a new register of violence measured in feet above the swell. 200 feet, that was the height at which Lana and his squadron would strike, skimming the ocean at between 200 and 250 meteoric, close enough to taste the spray, close enough to read the expressions on enemy faces before their bombs skimmed across the water like stones cast by giants. The Japanese had sailed from Rabaul, assuming their convoy safe beneath the umbrella of 8 destroyers and dozens of Zero fighters. They learned that the rules of sea combat had been altered forever. The change had its roots 2 months earlier in the headquarters of Lieutenant General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force. Throughout 1942, American bombers had been striking at Japanese ships with abysmal effect. Operating from relatively safe heights of 5,000 to 10,000 feet, bomber crews watched helplessly as ordnance fell wide of agile vessels, producing dramatic plumes of water but few hits. The numbers were brutal. In one convoy interdiction effort in January 1943, American aircraft flew 416 sorties and managed to sink only 2 ships while damaging 3 more. The Japanese were resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea with near impunity, and the balance in the Pacific hung in the balance. Kenney was a problem solver, a fighter pilot from the First World War known for iconoclastic thinking. He grasped that orthodox bombing doctrine was failing because ships could evade bombs dropped from altitude. The time a bomb took to fall from 10,000 feet gave captains nearly a minute to maneuver, presenting smaller profiles or steering between falling weapons. The fix required bombers to strike from altitude so low that ships would have no time to react. But flying a few hundred feet from heavily armed warships violated every rule of bomber survivability. Anti-aircraft batteries at that range would have unimpeded arcs of fire. A single hit could obliterate an aircraft instantaneously. The gamble was enormous. Yet Kenney had heard of a tactic that might alter the equation. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron had successfully used skip bombing at Rebel on October 22, 23, 1942, attacking at night and sinking vessels by releasing bombs that bounded across the sea like flat stones across a pond. The idea was elegantly direct. If a bomber approached a ship at very low altitude and released bombs at speed with delayed fuses, those munitions would skip along the surface, striking or passing beneath the target before detonating. Ben had shown the method worked in combat, but he was lost on January 18, 1943, when his B-17 vanished over New Guinea before he could adapt the technique for mass daylight operations. No one had yet tried coordinated attacks by whole squadrons. No one had finished the modifications needed to make medium bombers survivable at masthead height. No one had trained entire units in the split-second timing necessary to skip bombs successfully while under fierce enemy fire, until now. The designer of the altered B-25 was Major Paul Gunn, a former naval aviator whose wife and children had been stranded in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded. Gunn's personal fury at the enemy combined with his mechanical aptitude to produce what became known as the Commerce Destroyer. Working in makeshift maintenance sheds at Port Moresby, Gunn and his crew removed the bombardier's station from the nose of B-25 Mitchells and substituted it with 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. They added more weapons along the fuselage, eventually mounting 8 to 12 heavy machine guns that all fired forward. The result was a flying battleship that could pour devastating firepower into a target while approaching for a bomb run. The guns served multiple purposes. First, they suppressed anti-aircraft fire by sweeping enemy decks clear of gunners. The heavy slugs from 50 caliber weapons could penetrate destroyer hulls, knock out gun positions, and create chaos aboard target vessels. Second, the nose guns allowed the pilot to aim the entire aircraft like a giant weapon. Unlike high-altitude bombing, where a bombardier calculated complex trajectories, the low-altitude technique required the pilot to fly directly at the target and use a simple reference mark on his windscreen as a gun sight. When the mark aligned with the target ship, the co-pilot or bombardier released the bombs. The approach was brutally direct and demanded nerves of steel, but the modified aircraft were only half the equation. The other half was training pilots to fly them at suicidal altitudes with precision timing. That responsibility fell to Edward Lana, who took command of the 90th Bombardment Squadron in late December 1942. Lana was a barrel-chested pilot with a reputation for aggressive flying and absolute fearlessness. He wore a beat-up service cap pushed back on his head and was known among his men for being willing to lead any mission he ordered them to fly. When Kenny explained the concept and showed him the modified B-25s, Lana's response was characteristic. He would train his men, and they would not miss. Training began in January 1943 on the SS Pruth, a British steamer wrecked on Natiara Reef since December 31, 1923. For weeks, B-25 crews practiced diving to 200 FT and releasing practice bombs toward the rusting hulk in Port Moresby Harbor. Each pilot dropped 30 to 40 bombs, learning to use a windscreen reference mark instead of a bomb sight. When one crew struck the wreck's mast and crashed, killing all aboard, the squadron attended the funeral and resumed practicing the next day. Lana drove his men relentlessly because he understood what was at stake. The Japanese were consolidating their hold in New Guinea, building airfields that could threaten Australia itself. American and Australian ground forces were locked in brutal jungle warfare against an enemy that refused to surrender. Every Japanese convoy that reached New Guinea meant more troops, more ammunition, more supplies that would cost Allied lives to overcome. The only way to stop the convoys was to sink them at sea. By late February 1943, the 91st Squadron was ready. Lana reported to Kenny that his boys were a cocky gang who would not miss their targets. Within days, they had their chance to prove it. The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul on the night of February 28, 1943. Intelligence decrypts from Allied code rears had revealed the convoy's destination and approximate arrival time. Lae, New Guinea. 8 transport ships carried 6,900 troops desperately needed to reinforce Japanese positions. Protecting them were 8 destroyers, formidable warships bristling with anti-aircraft guns and veteran crews. The Japanese planners believed the convoy would be safe. They had routed it along the northern coast of New Britain to take advantage of storm fronts that would provide cloud cover. They had assigned experienced captains who understood convoy defense. They had scheduled the journey to minimize exposure to Allied air attacks. Everything had been calculated to ensure success. But the Allies were watching. Reconnaissance flights tracked the convoy from the moment it left Rabaul. On the afternoon of March 1st, a B-24 Liberator on patrol spotted the ships through a break in the clouds around 3 Ku. The crew radioed the coordinates and the convoy's course at 5th Air Force Headquarters. The information triggered a carefully prepared plan. Kenny assembled his forces. Heavy B-17 flying fortresses would strike first from medium altitude to scatter the convoy and force the ships into evasive maneuvers. Then the real attack would begin. Modified B-25s from the 91st Bombardment Squadron, A-20 Havocs from the 89th Attack Squadron, Australian Beaufighters armed with cannon and machine guns, all attacking at masthead height in coordinated waves that would overwhelm the convoy's defenses. The Japanese faced the full fury of low-altitude warfare for the first time on this scale. March 2nd began with frustration. Weather obscured the convoy through most of the day. B-7S sent to attack found only clouds and empty ocean. But by evening, the weather began to clear. On the morning of March 3rd, reconnaissance crews relocated the convoy steaming through the Bismarck Sea toward New Guinea. The ships were about 50 minutes southeast of Finchharen exactly where Allied planners had predicted they would be. Kenny gave the order. All units would attack. The battle was about to begin. Lana gathered his squadron commanders for final instructions. The plan called for different aircraft to attack from different altitudes simultaneously, creating confusion and dividing the convoy's defensive fire. B-7S would bomb from 5,000 to 7,000 ft. Beaufighters would strafe at the wavetop level. The B-25s would come in behind the Beaufighters at 200 ft, using their forward-firing guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire while delivering their bombs. Lana's orders to his pilots were direct. Find your target. Come in fast and low. Use your guns to clear the decks. Skip your bombs into the hull. Get out fast. The formation would attack in elements of 3 or 4 aircraft with wingmen providing covering fire while lead planes concentrated on bombing. They would approach targets from the beam parallel to the ship's length, maximizing the target profile and giving the bombs the best angle for skipping into the hull. Timing was critical. Release the bombs too early and they would bounce over the target. Too late and the aircraft would be directly over the ship when the delayed fuses detonated, destroying bomber and crew. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. At 8:55 a.m., the call came. The convoy had been positively identified and was within range. Lana shouted to his squadron, Cape Ward Hunt 0930, let's go. Engines roared to life. Modified B-25s began taxiing toward the runway at Port Moresby. Behind them, a 20 crews of the 89th prepared to follow. The plan called for all attacking aircraft to rendezvous over Cape Ward Hunt at 9:30 and strike at 10. As long as B-25 lifted off, he could see the coastline of New Guinea falling away behind him. Ahead lay open ocean and a Japanese convoy that had no idea what was coming. The flight to the target took less than an hour. At 10,000 ft, formation flying was smooth and the visibility was perfect. Lana could see the other elements of the strike force assembling. Heavy B-17s from the 43rd Bombardment Group climbed to altitude. P-38 Lightning fighters took up positions as top cover, ready to engage any Japanese fighters that might interfere. Australian Beaufighters. Twin-engine aircraft armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns dropped to wavetop altitude. Everything was coming together with textbook precision. At 9:55, lead B-17 spotted the convoy. 16 Japanese ships were visible on the water below, their wakes drawing white lines across the blue Pacific. 8 large transports steamed in formation, surrounded by 8 destroyers that maneuvered to provide anti-aircraft coverage. It was a formidable force, and the Japanese captains believed they were ready for any attack. At 10 a.m. precisely, the first B-7s began their bomb runs. Flying at 7,000 ft, they released 1,000 bombs that fell toward the convoy in long arcs. The Japanese response was immediate and intense. Destroyers and transports opened fire with every anti-aircraft gun they possessed. The sky filled with black bursts of exploding shells. Tracers arced upward in streams of fire. One transport took a direct hit and began listing immediately. Another was struck and caught fire, but most of the high-altitude bombs missed, creating massive columns of water that drenched the ships but did no damage. The Japanese captains breathed easier. This was conventional bombing. This they could handle. Then the Beaufighters arrived. 13 Royal Australian Air Force bow fighters came in at masthead height, skimming the waves at over 300 meters. Japanese gunners trained to track high-altitude bombers suddenly found themselves facing targets moving horizontally across their field of fire. Before they could adjust, the Beaufighters opened fire. 20mm cannon shells ripped through destroyer superructures. Machine gun bullets swept the decks of transport ships. The heavy cannons could penetrate armored positions. Japanese sailors and soldiers crouched behind whatever cover they could find as the Australian aircraft roared past, leaving chaos in their wake. The Beaufighter attack lasted only minutes, but it achieved its purpose. The convoy's defensive formation began to break apart. Destroyers mistaking the low-flying Beaufighters for torpedo bombers turned bow onto present smaller targets. This maneuver standard doctrine against torpedo attacks left the transport ships more exposed. Into this chaos came Lana and his B-25s. Lana's squadron approached from the southeast at 2,000 FT, giving the pilots time to select targets and plan their attack runs. Through his windscreen, he could see the convoy spread out below, ships maneuvering wildly, smoke rising from vessels already hit by the B-17. He selected his target, a large destroyer, and pushed his control column forward. The B-25 dropped toward the ocean in a controlled dive. At 200 FT, Lana leveled out and pushed his throttles to full power. The bomber accelerated to 225 mph, the ocean surface racing past just below his wheels. His 3 wingmen followed, spacing themselves to engage different targets. Lana armed his forward guns. At 100 weeds, Lana opened fire. 850 caliber machine guns in the nose of his B-25 erupted, sending streams of half-in bullets toward the destroyer. The effect was devastating. Japanese sailors on deck were cut down instantly. Gun positions exploded in showers of sparks as armor-piercing rounds penetrated steel. The destroyer's bridge windows shattered. Chaos erupted aboard the enemy vessel as gunners tried to return fire while being shredded by American machine guns. Lana held his course rock steady. The reference mark on his windscreen aligned perfectly with the destroyer's waterline. At 300 weed, his co-pilot called out her ranges. 200 wide, 100 D. At the precise moment, Lana's bombardier released 2 500 lb bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs dropped away and immediately struck the water. The delayed fuses prevented them from detonating on impact. Instead, the bombs skipped, bouncing off the ocean surface like stones carried forward by their momentum. The first bomb struck the water, bounced once, and slammed into the destroyer's hull at the waterline. The second bomb followed, hitting the water and skipping directly under the vessel. Lana pulled back on his control column, and the B-25 roared over the destroyer's mast with feet to spare. His gunners in the waist positions fired continuously, raking the destroyer's deck as they passed overhead. Seconds after the bombs hit, while Lana's B-25 was a 4-mile away, lead-delayed fuses detonated. Twin explosions ripped through the destroyer. The first bomb blew a massive hole in the hull at the waterline. The second bomb, exploding underneath the keel, broke the destroyer's back. The vessel began settling immediately, its watertight compartments flooding faster than damage control crews could respond. Behind Lana, his wingmen were executing their own attacks. Lieutenant Charles Howe went after a transport ship, his nose guns clearing the deck of personnel before his bombs skipped into the vessel's side. Captain John Henbury, leading the second element, fired continuously as he approached another transport, his tracers walking across the ship's superstructure. One of Henneby's bombs scored a direct hit amidships. The transport shuddered from the explosion, fire erupting from its cargo holds. Lieutenant John Smallwood attacked a different transport, putting 2 bombs into its hull and dropping 2 more on another vessel's bow. All around the convoy, B-25s were executing perfect attacks. The technique that had been tested in isolated night raids at Rebel was now working flawlessly on a massive scale. The Japanese response was hampered by the sheer speed and violence of the attack. Anti-aircraft gunners found themselves engaging targets that were on top of them before they could aim. The 50 caliber suppression fire from the B-25s made it nearly suicidal to man exposed gun positions. Sailors who'd try to fight back were cut down by streams of bullets. The water-skipping bombs themselves were devastating. Unlike high-altitude bombs that could be evaded by maneuvering, these weapons came in so fast and so low that evasion was impossible. By the time a lookout spotted an incoming B-25, the bomber had already released its weapons. Captains watched helplessly as bombs skipped across the water directly toward their ships, striking hulls with tremendous force before the delayed fuses sent explosives tearing through vital compartments. Following the B-25s came 12 A-20 Havoc light bombers from the 89th Attack Squadron, also flying at masthead height. Major Glenn Clark led the first wave of 6 aircraft, and as they approached the convoy, Clark could see explosions and fire from the B-25 attacks. He selected a large freighter as his target and began his run. At 200 FT and 240 MMP, Clark fired his forward guns and released 2 bombs. The weapons skipped perfectly, striking the transport and setting it ablaze. Clark's wing grazed the ship's radio mast as he pulled up and over, yet his A-20 remained airworthy. He banked around and spotted his target, later identified as Taimi Maru, burning fiercely from several direct strikes. Other A-20 pilots attacked with comparable success. Captain Ed Chudoba bombed the same freighter Clark had hit, guaranteeing its destruction. Captain Dixie Dunbar and Lieutenant Jack Taylor targeted Kembaru, the smallest vessel in the formation. Their bombs hit true, and the ship began to sink almost immediately. Above the chaos at sea level, P-38 Lightning fighters clashed with Japanese Zeros that had arrived to defend the convoy. The aerial battle was intense but short-lived. American pilots, flying aircraft superior in both speed and armament, shot down enemy fighters with disciplined precision. 3 P-38s were lost in the fight, but their sacrifice allowed the bombers to continue their runs unimpeded. The few Japanese fighters that broke through to engage the B-25s and A-20s met fierce defensive fire. Waist and tail gunners aboard the American bombers fired back relentlessly, sending several Zeros spiraling into the sea. By 10:15 a.m., a mere 15 minutes after the assault began, all 8 transport vessels had been struck, most burning or sinking. 3 of the 8 destroyers were heavily damaged or going under. The Bismarck Sea churned with wreckage, oil slicks, and Japanese sailors struggling in the water. Overhead, American and Australian crews could scarcely believe the scale of their success. The attack method they had drilled for weeks had surpassed every expectation. The low-altitude strikes weren't just effective, they were annihilating. The convoy that had departed Rabaul with such confidence was being wiped out systematically. Yet the battle wasn't finished. The Japanese, stubborn as ever, continued to resist. The remaining destroyers fought on even as the transports burned. That afternoon, Allied aircraft returned to complete the annihilation. The second wave mirrored the morning's devastation. B-17s struck from medium height while B-25s executed daring low-level attacks. By 3:36 p.m., 8 transports and 3 destroyers lay at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The destroyer Tokitsukaze drifted helplessly through the night, before finally sinking at sunset. On March 4th, only 4 destroyers, Shikanami, Asagamo, Yukazi, and Uranami, escaped, all bearing damage. The human toll was catastrophic. Of the 60 or 900 Japanese troops who had departed Rabaul bound for Leh, only about 1,200 reached land. Another 2,700 were picked up by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul, most without weapons or equipment. Around 2,090 Japanese sailors and soldiers perished, either going down with their ships or drowning in the oil-covered waters of the Bismarck Sea. For the Allies, losses were remarkably light. 13 American and Australian airmen killed, 10 in combat, 3 in accidents. 8 were wounded. 4 aircraft were lost to enemy action, while 1 B-17, 3 P-38s, 1 B-25, and a Beaufighter crashed in accidents. Against 12 Japanese ships destroyed and thousands of enemy casualties, the exchange rate defied belief. Controversy followed, haunting some of those involved for life. On March 4th, Allied aircraft and PT boats patrolled the wreck-strewn waters, seeking survivors. The orders were stark and absolute. Strafe the lifeboats, machine gun the rafts, and prevent enemy troops from reaching shore, where they could regroup and fight again. The logic was ruthless but strategic. Any Japanese soldier who reached New Guinea would have to be fought and killed in brutal jungle battles. Better, commanders reasoned, to end it at sea. Yet carrying out those commands left deep scars. Pilots reported sighting groups of survivors and being ordered to attack until none remained. PT boats fired on men struggling in the water throughout the night. American officers justified the action by citing Japanese atrocities and battlefield necessity. Japanese fighters had previously strafed U.S. airmen parachuting from the damaged B-17 Double Trouble, killing them as they descended. Soldiers in New Guinea had seen Japanese troops commit horrifying acts, bayoneting prisoners, practicing cannibalism, and fighting to the death rather than surrender. In such a brutal war, mercy seemed like a weakness neither side could afford. Even so, for those who carried out the attacks on survivors, the mission left lasting guilt. They understood the necessity, knew the enemy's record, yet shooting helpless men in the water violated something essential within them. General Douglas. MacArthur called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial encounter of the Southwest Pacific Campaign, and he was right. The battle proved that land-based aircraft could annihilate naval convoys without surface or carrier support. It showed that low-level bombing was not a desperate gamble but a viable, repeatable tactic. Most importantly, it sealed off Japan's supply routes to New Guinea. After the destruction of the Leh convoy, Japanese commanders made no further attempts to reinforce their positions there. The isolation of their garrisons was total, and defeat inevitable. For Major Edward Lana, the architect of the attacks, the victory marked the pinnacle of his career. He had taken an experimental nighttime tactic, refined it through tireless training, and led his men to results that shattered expectations. His B-25 crews achieved 17 direct hits from 37 bombs. Accuracy no high-altitude method could match. General Kenny praised Lana, recommending him for promotion and decoration. The 90th Bombardment Squadron became legendary across the Pacific. Tragically, Lana did not live to see the war's end. On April 30, 1943, less than 2 months after his triumph, he died in a crash while landing at WWII Airfield. Attempting his trademark maneuver, a steep dive followed by a sharp pull-up into a chandelle, his overloaded B-25 stalled and fell into a flat spin, exploding on impact. There were no survivors. He left behind a wife and 2 daughters and was buried at Port Moresby with full military honors, his legacy secured by the 15 minutes of combat that redefined naval warfare. Captain John Henbury. One of Lana's wingmen assumed command of the 90th Squadron and led it through the remainder of the war, continuing to use Lana's perfected techniques to sink dozens more enemy ships. Henbury himself rose to Major General and later served as President of the Air Force Association, preserving the spirit of innovation and audacity that Lana had embodied. The tactical breakthroughs of the Bismarck Sea spread throughout the Pacific and beyond. Other squadrons converted B-25s into gunships with nose cannons and forward-firing machine guns. A-20 and B-26 units adopted low-level strikes as their standard anti-shipping procedure. The strategy reached even the Mediterranean, where U.S. bombers employed it against German and Italian vessels. The British, who had dabbled with similar methods early in the war, refined their own versions after witnessing the American success. The psychological shock to Japan's Navy was immense. Captains who once felt secure under destroyer escort and fighter cover now knew they were vulnerable to attacks they couldn't counter. The convoy system that had sustained Japan's island garrisons became untenable wherever Allied air power could reach. Forced to depend on submarines and fast destroyer runs under cover of night, the Japanese accepted smaller loads and greater danger. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated General Kenny's strategic insight, his willingness to repurpose conventional bombers for unconventional missions, his embrace of innovation, and his faith in bold leaders like Lana. His approach became a blueprint for air operations across the Pacific. The 5th Air Force gained dominance over the Southwest Pacific, paving the way for MacArthur's island-hopping advance. The technical lessons were equally crucial. Aircraft engineers learned that medium bombers could be redesigned for roles far beyond their intended purpose. The B-25 Mitchell, built as a standard medium bomber, evolved into one of the most adaptable aircraft of the war. Its forward-firing gunship design influenced post-war attack planes, embedding the principle of combining suppressive fire with precise strike capability into modern close-air support doctrine. For the men who fought there, the experience was life-changing. They had trained for a mission that seemed impossible, flown into walls of flak at point-blank range, and delivered their bombs with perfect timing at speeds that left no room for error. And they had triumphed beyond all imagination. The confidence gained from that success carried through the rest of their military service. Men who had doubted the tactics before the battle became its most fervent advocates afterward. Crews that had been skeptical about attacking warships at 200 FT became eager for more missions. The 90th Squadron developed an Esprita Corps that made it one of the most effective units in the Pacific Theater. The statistical analysis of the battle reveals the dramatic effectiveness of low-altitude attacks compared to conventional high-altitude tactics. The B-7 bombers bombing from 5,000 to 7,000 FT achieved approximately a 3% hit rate, consistent with peacetime practice but inadequate against maneuvering targets. The B-25s and A-20 using low-altitude techniques at 200 FT achieved hit rates exceeding 50%, with some crews scoring hits with every bomb dropped. The difference was attributable to multiple factors. Reduced distance meant less time for targets to maneuver. Horizontal trajectory required less precise timing than vertical drops. Suppressive fire degraded enemy defensive capabilities, and the psychological impact of aircraft roarings over mast heads disrupted enemy response coordination. The development of the technique required solving numerous technical challenges. Bombs had to be equipped with delayed fuses that would survive the initial impact with water without detonating. The fuse delay had to be long enough for the aircraft to escape the blast radius, but short enough that the weapon detonated against or near the target. Pilots learned through extensive practice that releasing bombs from exactly 200 FT at speeds between 200 and 250 mph produced the most consistent results. Deviations of even 20 ft in altitude or 10 mph in speed could cause bombs to sink immediately rather than skip, or to skip over the target entirely. The precision required was extraordinary, achieved through hundreds of practice runs and the innate skill of experienced pilots who could gauge altitude and speed by instinct. The modified B-25s themselves represented a remarkable feat of field engineering. Major Paul Gunn and his maintenance crews performed modifications that North American Aviation, the manufacturer, had never imagined. The structural changes required to mount additional weapons. The electrical systems needed to fire multiple machine guns simultaneously. The ammunition storage solutions for thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition all had to be improvised with limited tools and resources. That these field modifications worked reliably under combat conditions testified to the ingenuity and dedication of the ground crews. Many of the maintenance personnel worked 18-hour days keeping the aircraft flyable. They scred parts from damaged planes. They fabricated brackets and mounts from scrap metal. They kept the B-25s in there through determination and improvisation. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also highlighted the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance in modern warfare. The Allied victory was possible only because code reekers had revealed the convoy's route and destination. Reconnaissance aircraft had located and tracked the ships despite bad weather. Communication systems had coordinated attacks by multiple squadrons across vast distances. The integration of intelligence, reconnaissance, and strike capabilities demonstrated the evolution of warfare into an increasingly technological and information-dependent enterprise. The Japanese convoy failed not because its commanders were incompetent, but because every aspect of its mission had been compromised by superior Allied intelligence gathering and exploitation. In the broader context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point in the struggle for New Guinea. Japanese forces on the island, already under pressure from Australian and American ground forces, found themselves cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The garrison at Lae, which the destroyed convoy had been intended to reinforce, fell to Allied forces 6 months later in September 1943. The Japanese defensive perimeter contracted inexorably as island after island fell to American amphibious assaults supported by overwhelming air power. The air superiority that made these invasions possible was built on the foundation laid at the Bismarck Sea. The battle demonstrated that Allied forces could dominate not just the skies, but also the seas around contested territories through innovative application of land-based air power. The human dimension of the battle deserves remembrance. Beyond the statistics of ships sunk and aircraft lost were individual stories of courage and sacrifice. The B-17 crew who bailed out of double trouble only to be machine-gunned by Japanese fighters while dangling helplessly in their parachutes. The P-38 pilots who went down fighting to protect the bombers. The Japanese sailors who stayed at their posts firing anti-aircraft guns even as their ships disintegrated around them. The Allied air crew who flew mission after mission, knowing that a single mistake at 200 E meant certain death. War demands courage from all participants, and the Battle of the Bismarck witnessed extraordinary courage on both sides. The controversy over attacks on survivors has never been fully resolved. Military historians generally accept that the decision was militarily justifiable within the context of total war in the Pacific. Every Japanese soldier eliminated at sea meant lives saved among Allied ground forces who would otherwise have faced those soldiers in combat, given Japanese tactical doctrine that emphasized fighting to the death and made surrender almost unknown, allowing survivors toward shore guaranteed more casualties later. Yet the ethical dimension remains troubling. Attacking helpless men in the water violated codes of military honor that dated back centuries. The pragmatic argument that Japanese forces would have done the same and had done worse does not fully address the moral complexity. Some participants struggled with the memory for the rest of their lives, while others maintained that they had simply done what war required. Modern military analysts studying the Battle of the Bismarck Sea identify several key factors that contributed to Allied success. Tactical innovation driven by operational necessity solved the problem of hitting maneuvering ships. Realistic training prepared crews for actual combat conditions. Combined arms coordination used different aircraft types in complementary roles. Excellent intelligence provided targeting information and enabled mission planning. Technological adaptation modified standard aircraft for specialized roles. Each factor was necessary. Together, they were sufficient for victory. The battle serves as a case study in how innovation, training, intelligence, and combined operations can overcome numerical or technological disadvantages. Edward Lana's legacy extends far beyond his short life. His willingness to embrace an unconventional tactic and his skill in training men to execute it saved countless Allied lives. Every Japanese soldier who died in the Bismarck Sea was one less enemy that American or Australian infantry would face in the jungles of New Guinea. Every ship sunk represented one less cargo of weapons and ammunition that would kill Allied soldiers. The technique Lana perfected became the standard for anti-shipping operations throughout the Pacific War. Thousands of Japanese vessels fell to low-altitude attacks over the following 2 years. The oceanic lifelines that Japan depended upon to maintain its distant empire were methodically cut by aircraft flying at heights that traditional doctrine had long considered suicidal. In reunions held many decades later, veterans of the Bismarck Sea battle recalled the mission with both pride and disbelief. Pride in what they had achieved, and wonder that they had lived through it. The 15 minutes of combat at mast-top altitude, plunging through curtains of anti-aircraft fire and releasing bombs with split-second accuracy, remained the most intense moments of their existence. Many likened it to flying straight through hell. Yet they emerged triumphant. Their strategy vindicated, their bravery proven, their place in history assured. The lessons confirmed at the Bismarck Sea still resonate in modern military practice. Ingenuity can defeat conventional constraints. Rigorous training prepares warriors for real battle. The fusion of diverse capabilities produces outcomes greater than any single effort. Modifying existing technology meets urgent demands faster than waiting for flawless designs. Effective use of intelligence provides decisive superiority. These truths, first demonstrated in the skies over the Bismarck Sea 8 decades ago, continue to guide military thought and operations today. Though the names of those who fought are slowly fading into history, the principles they confirmed through sacrifice and valor remain vital to every generation tasked with defending liberty. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea endures as one of the defining clashes of the Pacific War. A Japanese convoy that should have arrived safely was instead annihilated by innovative tactics. executed with remarkable precision. The method that brought this victory was once considered almost suicidal by standard military theory. Edward Lana and his men proved that such thinking was obsolete. They flew at altitudes that invited annihilation, released bombs with timing that left no room for error, and achieved results beyond imagination. 12 Japanese vessels disappeared beneath the waves of the Bismarck Sea. Thousands of enemy troops perished. The supply route to New Guinea was severed, and the momentum of the war shifted irreversibly toward Allied triumph, all within 15 minutes of combat that showcased the strength of innovation, courage, and resolve. What was once forbidden became accepted doctrine. What had been deemed reckless evolved into routine. The mission once thought impossible became the blueprint for countless future victories. Edward Lana did not live to see the Pacific War's end, but his contribution to its outcome was immeasurable. The pilots who followed him into battle at 200 feet carried his spirit onward. The tactics he refined sank hundreds of Japanese ships in the years that followed. The bravery he embodied inspired thousands of airmen, who faced the same deadly skies. His name deserves remembrance among the great pioneers of military art, the leaders who reshaped warfare through imagination and audacity. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was his masterpiece, and its lessons still echo through time, urging new generations to confront emerging challenges with the same blend of creativity, discipline, valor, and determination that defined those 15 unforgettable minutes over the Pacific in March 1943, when everything changed.